Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Nancy. She just waves me off. Yes, hi, Lucy. Oh, okay. Sorry. We're going to get started just to honor time for people. But we'll probably run over a little because we're good at that. And thanks for being here tonight to be a part of this courageous conversation. Oh, good. Come on in. Hey, welcome. Come on in. To be a part of the courageous conversation, this whole thing started from your mouths of being curious in our one-on-one conversations through our renewal process. And so we wanted to make sure that we left time and space to explore that a little bit. So we have Pastor Emmy Kegler here tonight. She was with us earlier today too, but Pastor Emmy, she can talk about herself, but she's here tonight to talk about LGBTQ and the church, and give some explanations and better understanding of things, share some of her own experience, and then we definitely will leave ample time afterwards for us to answer questions or process through questions that we're all still wondering together, and make sure that whatever agenda you may have on your mind, that we can make sure that we make time and space for that as well. So, Emmy, thank you for being here. Mm-hmm. And Mary, thank you for being here. Mary is the head of our renewal team, and so I invited her to be up as a part of kind of the leadership in this process as well. So let's open up with a word of prayer. Good and gracious God, we give you great thanks for this day to gather together as your people that live on a spectrum, that all don't think identical to all the things in our lives. And so we give you thanks for this time and space to be able to ask and wonder and be curious and to learn and grow. I ask that you surround Pastor Emmy in her speaking and give her wisdom and strength, and that you guide us with open hearts and open minds through listening, but also through the braveness of asking the questions that have been weighing on our hearts, and learning from one another so we may know what it means to be your people that are loving and welcoming to everyone. Lord, we pray all these things in your name. Amen.
Amen.
The floor is yours, my dear.
Wonderful.
We'll take a seat.
Let you two sit down. Yeah. Well, as Pastor Molly said, my name is Emmy Kegler. I am a pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Northeast Minneapolis, and for the past 3 years, Grace Lutheran has also been home to an LGBTQ outreach ministry that specifically focuses on creating protected space for LGBTQ people who want to maintain a connection with Christian community and yet for one of many possible reasons can't. And in that 3 years, we've come to a lot of important understandings about what it means to be community, about what it means to be church, about what it means to be Christian, and beyond all of those practices together. So what I'm going to offer for you in about 32 and a half minutes is what is usually a 6-hour presentation. So there are going to be a lot of gaps. Please feel free to ask questions where things don't connect. As Pastor Molly said, we'll have time at the end for questions, and know that I am throwing a lot at you at once. What we're hoping for, what I want to get us to today is through an understanding of contemporary understandings of gender and sexuality, and also through how that affects LGBTQ people as we relate to scriptures, and then finally as we come into Christian community and what it truly means to be welcomed into a Christian church.
Bring your mic a little closer.
Am I too quiet still?
There we go. You're good, yeah.
Okay, I'm just gonna.
No, you're good.
All right, okay.
Go for it.
So where I want to start is at the beginning, quite literally at the beginning of our lives. When we are first conceived and our parents are informed of our existence in the womb, when either the doctor turns to them or the nurse who's running the ultrasound, or perhaps at the moment of birth, one of the first things out of a doctor or nurse's or fellow parent's mouth is, "It's a boy," or "It's a girl." From the very beginning, we start sorting kids into these two boxes. In fact, that's a common question when we know that parents are expecting. Do you know? Is it a boy? Is it a girl? That tells us how we want to decorate the nursery, what kinds of clothes we're going to buy, what colors we might dress our children in. Sociologically, there have been tests done on large groups of people, and if you dress children on the exact same toddler in blue or pink, no matter what the sex of the child is, if the child is dressed in blue, people will play with that child differently than if it's dressed in pink. And most sadly, if you dress the child in a gender-neutral color, like yellow or brown, people are less likely to engage with the child at all. Because even from the beginning, the majority of human populace as we are now want to know, how do I relate to you? And that includes, what is your gender? So from the very beginning, doctors assign a sex to us, male or female, based on, usually, our, to be crass, exterior genitals. But the interesting thing is that we know from biology and we know from human experience that there is an additional category, that although most of us fall into the genital box of boy or girl, there are people who don't have clearly defined sex characteristics in that way. Sometimes that can be about exterior genitalia. Sometimes it might be a blood test that reveals that there are additional or lacking chromosomes or hormones. Sometimes it's not something that's discovered until someone is later in life, like puberty, when they try to conceive, or even at death. Usually the category we put these people into are intersex. So they're not male, not female, but this space in the middle where there's shared sex characteristics or missing sex characteristics. So this might be, for example, a kid who gets to, who was assigned male at birth, so the doctor looked and said, I see a little penis on that ultrasound, you have a boy. And the kid grew up and felt comfortable being a boy, felt comfortable in boy clothes, felt comfortable with male pronouns, and around 11 or 12, starts feeling some weird sort of internal pain around the hip bones. And they go in for an ultrasound and find out not only does this 11 or 12-year-old boy have what we would consider sort of normal genitalia for a man, but also has ovaries hiding in there. And these are now starting to try to mature at 11 or 12, as they would do in someone that we had assigned female sex to, but all of a sudden it's happening in the same body that is assigned male. What does that mean? Is this boy now not a boy? Is this boy now a girl? Is this boy now somewhere in the middle? How does he choose to identify? This can be one of the experiences of being intersex, of not fitting easily into that box of boy or girl. In the past, the term sometimes used for people like that was hermaphrodite. That's still common in biology, especially when you're talking about like mushrooms and plants, but it's it's considered a bit archaic and overly scientific, so that's not how we relate to other human beings. When we talk about somebody who doesn't fit into those assigned sex characteristics, where you're talking about somebody who doesn't fit into the genital box of boy or girl, we say intersex. It's an adjective, so he is intersex or she is intersex, not they are an intersex. We also know that even when somebody fits genitalia-wise into the box of boy or girl, that may not be an accurate understanding of who they are internally. The internal gender compass doesn't seem to be lining up with the way that people look at them. This is usually what we call gender non-conforming. People who do not align perfectly with their assigned sex. There are other categories under gender non-conforming. Usually the two big ones that we talk about are non-binary and transgender. So someone like myself, when I was a few months from being born, they checked on the ultrasound and they said, we're pretty sure it's going to be a girl. And I came out and they said, it is a girl. My mom said, great, that means we're going to give her the girl name we picked. Her name is Emmy. And as I grew up, she said, this is Emmy, my daughter. And as I continued to grow, I enjoyed dresses. I primarily socialized with other girls. I was comfortable being introduced as a daughter and as a she, and have grown into understanding myself as female. This is true for, it's difficult to say, but at this point we estimate about 95% of the population, and that is called cisgender, C-I-S, people who are aligned with the gender they were assigned at birth. Someone who is transgender is someone who is not aligned with the gender assigned at birth. That internal compass does not point in the same direction that everyone's expecting. And what that can look like can happen at different stages in life. Some people do not realize they are transgender, that they don't fit into the box that was assigned them based on their genitalia, very late in life. Some people can realize it when they're in a sort of mid-stage of life, 20s and 30s. Some people realize it around puberty. We now know that kids can start to realize that even as young as 3 and 4, when they start to receive the label of, you're a girl, and they start to push back and say, I don't want to be called a daughter, I want to be your son. Now, we know that kids go through multitudinous periods of different ways they identify, right? I have a dear friend whose kid has strongly identified as a dinosaur for about 5 months. Now, this is very distinct from identifying, and usually what we talk about when kids are especially young is less using the label of transgender and talking more about being gender expansive. They're playing with their understandings of gender roles. But in particular, when we start talking about a kid who might be gender nonconforming in a way that might lead them to being transgender, doctors and psychiatrists are looking for 3 particular markers. Are they persistent? Are they consistent? And are they insistent? So persistence points to the fact that it lasts over time. It doesn't only happen for perhaps those 5 months when they've just seen the land before time and they're really into T-Rexes right now. It continues over years. So that's persistence. Consistence, meaning it is a continual identification. It isn't one day yes and the other day no. It isn't one day I'm a dinosaur, the next day I'm a dog. It is consistently saying, you keep calling me a daughter and I am a son. Third, it's insistent, so a kid who can continually voice that out loud rather than being casual about it. These are not necessarily the only markers of someone being transgender, but it's the 3 things that doctors, psychiatrists, and other medical professionals look for when they're working with parents and families to understand how do we work with this kid who is in some way gender non-conforming. It's important to note, especially in the context of some bills that are coming forward, one that was just defeated in South Dakota, the way that the medical profession responds to kids who are gender nonconforming. There are some scare tactics that go around that suggest that people who are proponents of kids identifying as transgender want to have what they call sterilization surgeries performed on these kids. It's simply not true. Surgeries to do any sort of body modification are not done on kids younger than 16. In most states, you wait till 18, which is the same kind of thing we'd see in a lot of other major surgeries that are not deeply medically necessary. I'll get into medical necessity in a second. When I talk about medical necessity, what we find is that trans kids who are allowed to socially transition, allowed to use the name and pronouns that they choose for themselves rather than those that are aligned with the sex they were assigned at birth. Their mental health increases, they do better in school, they have better connection with friends, and their suicidal ideation drops. So letting kids socially transition helps them. We also find that there are sometimes medical transitions that can be helpful to kids who are going through this process of trying to figure out, how do I relate to my body and how do I relate to the world around me? So for kids younger than 16, what's often used are hormone blockers. Because if you can remember back to being a prepubescent teenager and that moment when we start to crest into puberty and how awkward and terrifying and horrific your body sometimes feels, this is even more difficult for a kid who is growing up and saying, I'm not your daughter, I'm not your daughter, I'm a son, I'm a boy, I'm a boy. And then at 12 and 13, as his friends are starting to sprout hairs on their cheeks, starting to see their Adam's apple come into more prominence, starting to hear their voices drop, all these hallmarks of secondary sex characteristics. Instead, this kid who has been saying over and over again, but I'm a boy, I'm not your son, or I am your son, I'm not your daughter, gets his period. Because his body says, you have a vagina and a uterus, you were marked as female, and therefore this is the puberty you'll go through. That's a horrifying enough experience for a cisgender woman to have her first periods, right? To go through the pain and the sometimes the stigma that goes with that. How many people got uncomfortable when I said period? But then to imagine going through that when you're already deeply uncomfortable with the structure that your body has. This is usually called gender dysphoria. Not every trans person has gender dysphoria, but this is what we often are looking for, again, in kids and teens. So what was used is hormone blockers. It puts pause on that pubescent transition to be able to say, let's take a little extra time, let's make sure we're meeting with enough doctors, let's make sure we're going through therapeutic processes, let's make sure the family's all on the same page, and figure out, is this kid truly just going through a phase or going through some sort of body rejection, some other kind of body dysphoria that can be treated? Or is this the presence of being transgender or gender nonconforming? Somebody who is never going to feel comfortable in a body that has been forced to be, or that is forcing the person inside it to be a gender that doesn't match who they are. When transgender people grow older, so past that age of 16 or 18, there are a myriad of options for transitioning. I've talked already about social transitioning. That's using name and pronouns that are more in line with who a person identifies as, rather than what the box is that has gone around who their genitals say they're supposed to be. It can also include legal transitioning, getting name and gender markers changed on driver's licenses or passports. Did you know when you go through the TSA screening at the airport, you have to do this, and then it does the and then they tell you, step out, please. Do you know that there's a little screen that comes up and they have to choose if you're male or female?
No.
So the pulls up a little digital screen that only the TSA agent can see, or me if you're like me and you look at everything. And it shows sort of a little heat map of your body. And there are two boxes down in the corner. One is pink and one is blue. And TSA pushes which button they have decided that your sexual characteristics line up with based on how you look. And then the machine knows. You pushed the pink button, that means there shouldn't be anything interesting happening right here. So if something comes up, they say, there's a problem, we need to do a pat down. This person is carrying something around their genital hip area that shouldn't be there. Now, if you can imagine being somebody who is a trans person, for example, someone who was raised and told over and over again, you're a boy, and has said out loud and out loud, I'm not your son, I'm your daughter, please understand who I am. To be passing through TSA, and to have TSA say, female, and then say, excuse me ma'am, please step aside. There's something in your pants that we're gonna have to pat down. How deeply uncomfortable. So one of the huge things in legal transition is getting gender markers changed on driver's licenses so that when that happens and they say, there's something showing up on the scan that really shouldn't be, if you're female as we're assuming you to be, you can say, okay, fine, but here are legal documents that establish that you don't have to question who I am. I am female, I am not trying to trick the markers by going through this process in a dress. So what is happening there is social and legal transition, but also there's medical transition. So there's the hormone therapy that I already talked about, hormone blockers. Later in life, some transgender people choose to pursue hormone replacement therapy. That's when, if the hormones have been blocked that would normally produce alongside whatever the genitalia dictate, we start to talk about replacement with estrogen or testosterone. This is obviously done in conjunction with consultation with the doctor, because I don't know if you know this, but just randomly throwing hormones into your body does not go well. So just as we have to do hormone replacement therapy sometimes as we age, these are practices that are done in consultation with medical professionals. Sometimes transgender people are asked if they have had the surgery. The surgery, meaning, usually, have you done something to your body that now makes it conform more to what I expect a woman or a man to be? First, there is not one particular surgery that a transgender person undergoes. There are a myriad of possible surgeries that can be chosen, like top surgery for for a man who has breasts, or perhaps an Adam's apple reduction surgery for a woman who has an Adam's apple. There can be voice therapies that can sometimes be surgical processes to try to raise or lower the natural tenor of the voice. Not every transgender person chooses to go through any or all of those surgeries, and it doesn't make them more or less transgender to have done more or fewer surgeries. In the past, sometimes within the community there's been a distinction between transgender and transsexual. So a transgender person was someone who was not conforming to what their genitalia said they should be, and a transsexual person was someone who had had the surgery. Again, there isn't one the surgery. And making that kind of distinction between somebody who fits in this box and someone who fits in that box just perpetuated stereotypes within the community. So generally speaking, the term transsexual along with transvestite have really fallen out of use in the transgender community. Some people still use them, but they're more few and far between. In addition to the fact that there are a myriad of possible medical interventions, generally speaking, in human society, it is considered impolite as to inquire to the status of someone else's genitals. But unfortunately, in the case of transgender people, somehow it's experienced as something we can ask about. is people will often ask, have you had the surgery? Famous transgender women who've been interviewed even on places like The View that are relatively progressive thinking have had someone look at them and say, so if I saw you naked, what would I see? Which is really not an appropriate question unless you are planning to marry this person. The only person who needs to know what you look like naked are yourself, your spouse, your doctor, and God. Maybe. I'm not even sure if God needs to know. So generally speaking, asking about someone's surgical status or someone, whether or not they've had the surgery or what their body might look like, if we think about that and the fact that we're asking someone what their genitalia look like, we can experience kind of the discomfort that a trans person might experience if we ask them that. Even when we're trying to be supportive or helpful, that question can still really sting. So I've talked a little bit about assigned sex and then about gender identity. What we start to see coming up often in puberty is sexual orientation. These are usually the first few letters of that alphabet soup that we get in the LGBT community, the L, the G, and the B. L and G, as we may know, stand for lesbian and for gay. These are words that are relatively well known now, lesbian being a woman who is attracted to other women, and gay sometimes specifically for a man who's attracted to other men, but can also be used as sort of an umbrella term for the whole community. Bisexual, that B as part of that LGBT, is used to identify people who are attracted to multiple genders. At one point in time, bisexual was specifically, there are two genders, male and female, and I am attracted to both, bi like a bicycle. But of course, as we've come to understand that gender has a lot greater variety than that, bisexual has taken on a slightly different understanding. It still remains an umbrella term for being attracted to more than one gender. Now some people still identify as bisexual and define it as I am attracted to two genders. My gender's like me and gender's not like me. But that can include cisgender women, transgender men, cisgender men, without distinguishing and saying we have to decide which of the different genders we might be attracted to. Because that starts again to draw those lines between what does it mean to be a woman, what does it mean to be a man, and that starts to reinforce again those boxes that we found don't fit everyone. Where are we at? Okay, 636, great. In addition, as part of that large alphabet soup, I've talked about the L, the G, and the B, about the T, also about the I for intersex. There's also, as part of that long string of letters, often added an A for asexual. These are people who don't experience sexual attraction at all. It's simply not a factor in their lives. Some of them still experience romantic attraction and might end up in relationships, even happily having sex with their partners, but it's not something that they think about or are interested in most of the time, or even all of the time. Because society expects most of us to like or want sex and to be in sexual relationships, people who don't experience sexual attraction, asexual people, have also been brought into the LGBTQ community because we too know what it's like to have expectations put on us by society that don't fit. So asexual people have also become part of this acronym. And finally, the Q as part of that acronym. For some, it means questioning, people who are still figuring out what best way to understand themselves and the people around them. But we also use it to stand for queer. Queer has almost as many, well, perhaps as many tensions as the word gay does. We know that youth still, in this day and age, use the word gay as a slur for that's stupid, that's so gay, kids will still say. In the same way, the word queer, which was meant to signify and separate the fact that there were people who experienced sexual attraction and gender identity differently than the norm, became a slur. There are still playgrounds where kids play Smear the Queer, where the boys get together and chase down the most feminine of the boys and essentially try to physically or verbally abuse him into social conformity. So queer has been a tricky term. Some people, especially older generations within the LGBT community, do not find it liberative. But others, and maybe slightly more in the younger portions of the community, find that it's a great term for understanding the wide variability of how we understand ourselves. That at 12, when I didn't have a lot of words for things, I knew that I was gay, But as I've come to be older and started to understand the great variety of gender diversity, of how I understand my own sexual orientation, that gay can sometimes mean too much, like I am female and therefore attracted to other women, and that is very clearly defined within these boxes. The word queer can be a lot more expansive and say, in some way, my sexual orientation does not fit society's understanding of what it should be based on how I look. So for some people, queer is a great and beautiful reclamation, or a term of reclamation and liberation. For some people, it is not. Generally speaking, if a person uses the word queer for themselves or for the community that they represent, you can also use it. If they don't use it, you can't sort of retroactively apply it to them. So if I had come tonight and said, I am Emmy and I am a gay woman, it would be a little odd to go out and say, I met someone who's queer. Because again, that's a tricky term. So if I use a tricky term for myself, it's okay to use it with other people, but it's not okay to decide to apply it to anybody without knowing that's how they identify. Of course, all of this comes into a great and troubled mix when it starts to intersect with religion, especially with Christianity. LGBTQ people at basically any stage and age of life are expected to have the level of a master or higher of theology, that we are able to pull out of our back pocket at any time a perfect explanation of how the biblical texts apply to our lives and to the world around us in a way that addresses historical context, literary terms, that understands the different, not only the historical context of the text, but also all of the ancient Near East cultures happening around us. I don't know if you know this, but most of us aren't born with this knowledge. So most of us who grow up LGBTQ in the church have to piece together that knowledge throughout our lives that essentially acts as a protectant against people around us. Because unfortunately, the majority of Christians do still use scripture primarily as a weapon against the existence and acceptance of LGBTQ people. They bring verses from the Bible, we usually call these clobber verses, that say there are certain ways that we were expected to behave, and being openly LGBTQ is not one of them. So one example from that would be the passage in Paul's letter to the Romans in the first chapter. When Paul is describing, let me see here, what does he say? This gets quoted at me all the time. Verse 1, 26 through 27. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. First of all, that's a translation from the NRSV, and goodness gracious, is it ever clunky. They really do not get into the poetry that Paul often goes to. But so essentially, there have not been very many experiences in my 16 years of doing this work where someone doesn't quote this verse at me as if I've never heard it. But most of us who are LGBTQ and have some relationship with Christianity carry around with us ways to interpret these passages that we're expected to be able to pull out of our pocket at the drop of a hat. For anybody who has decided that we were going from introduction to Bible study.
Yep.
So what happens with that is that I'm expected to be able at any point, if I'm tired, if I'm handling, if I'm in the midst of a a vacation Bible school and I have 16 kids around me, if I'm in the middle of greeting people on a Sunday morning, if I have just wrapped up a presentation on mental illness and suicide and have briefly mentioned the fact that I'm gay as context to that, somebody will quote this at me. Which means no matter where I am in my life, I have to remember to be able to pull it out of my back pocket. Well, that sentence starts with, for this reason, God gave them up to the degrading passions. So we have to back up and see what are the reasons that God gave them up into degrading passions. Well, it's because they were practicing idolatry even though they knew the truth about God. So this is actually a story about pagan idolatry. And in addition, it specifically says that it's giving up natural intercourse for unnatural, but if we fall in line with psychological understandings that sexual orientation is not corruptible and therefore it cannot be changed through therapy and therefore might actually be a natural tendency for some people to be gay or lesbian or even bisexual. And Paul then follows that up in Romans 2 with the fact that he says, therefore none of you can judge for you all are condemned. I have to be able to carry that with me like all the time. That's exhausting. So many LGBTQ people feel that level of anxiety when they come into a church space. A lot of the churches that I work with or talk to, even the church that I served when I first got there, have conversations around, well, why would we need to be explicitly welcoming to LGBTQ people, we're welcoming to everybody. There are churches that have all are welcome on their signs, or we begin our worship with a proclamation that all are welcome. We sing hymns like all are welcome in this place. We have it on the bottom of our websites. We have it mentioned in our bulletin. Why would we need to be specific about LGBTQ people? Well, unfortunately, the phrase all are welcome is not copyrighted. Any church can use it, and in fact, many churches that are explicitly condemning of LGBTQ people use that phrase. They use it in advertising, they use it on their signs, they use it as the bottom of their websites or on their bulletins. They say, all are welcome. And then they have specific sermon series that talk about the only way to interpret the Bible is to understand that marriage must be between one man and one woman. The only way to understand gender is to understand that the box you were put in at birth based on your genitalia is the box that dictates your life. The only way to understand sexuality is to understand it within a heterosexual and cisgender application. And these churches still say, on their Instagram feeds, on their Facebook pages, all are welcome. So unfortunately, when we say, but this church is a welcoming church, but we say all are welcome, the problem is it's not a copyrighted phrase, and there are other churches that use it. There are other churches that will actively invite in people and hide the fact that they're condemning of LGBTQ people until it comes up and gets handed out sideways. A good number of the folks at Queer Grace Community, in fact, almost all of my worship leadership team, have participated in Christian community at one point in time, and then at some point came out. They liked a status on Facebook in support of marriage equality when it went through Abershville v. Hodge in the Supreme Court. They posted something on Instagram for Coming Out Day. They came to church with their girlfriend and suddenly got pulled aside and said, you need to have a conversation with the pastor, or you can't be on worship leadership anymore, or you're going to have to resign from council. So unfortunately, churches that still say all are welcome can still practice these really exclusionary policies, which means that for a lot of the folks that I work with at Queer Grace Community and a lot of the people that I know who have maintained connections to the Christian church come into the church with their shoulders up because we're waiting for the shoe to drop. We're waiting for someone to say something about biblical truth. That's a big red flag for most of us. That sends up a flare that says this person is probably not about to say something along the lines of biblical truth like, God loves you, and God loves you so much that Jesus died for you and wants to forgive everything and reunite you with God. Usually what biblical truth means is God loves you and therefore you're going to hell unless you do as I say, for people like me. So we have to spend a lot of time when we're trying to find a new church figuring out what they believe. If a church is not explicit about its beliefs, we'll go through old sermons, we'll Google search the pastor and see if they've written blogs, we will check with friends around the area and say, do you know anything about this church? We'll check for those trick words like biblical or truth. We'll look to see if there's marriage groups that separate men and women, because then that says we have groups for men and women, and you better fall into one of those categories and you can't participate in our marriage group unless you are one or the other. Some churches, no, I'm going to skip that, never mind, it's not that important. Some churches deliberately hide that they're not welcoming and in fact will try to invite, rather than a conversation over email, if they're invited to one, like, hey, would you allow your pastor to perform a same-gender wedding, which is kind of our lowest bar for knowing if we'd be welcome. I have a friend who got into a very, very long Facebook discussion with somebody because she got this invitation to their church where they said all are welcome, and she said, cool, I don't notice anything on your website about LGBTQ people. What's your policy? Are you affirming? Are you unaffirming? Tell me anything. I said, oh, we don't like to have those conversations over Facebook. I don't think I'm a good writer. I think those conversations are much better had in person. It's not about policy, it's about relationship. Let's get coffee and talk about it. Which is such a lovely invitation, except that most of the time for LGBTQ people, what that means is for 45 minutes to an hour and a half, I'm going to be stuck in a caribou with somebody who wants to confirm for me that I'm going to go to hell. Very rarely does somebody say, I don't want to put my policy in writing, but I do actually love you and think that you are valuable and beloved before God, and therefore you can bring your partner to church and we will celebrate your marriage. Usually what it means when they say, let's get coffee and talk about it is, you're not welcome here as you are, but I know that if I write that down, you won't come. Unfortunately, this same kind of problem comes up when we have churches that are still welcoming and even might be affirming and kind, but don't have a way of stating that out loud for their existing members. So I've talked a little bit about visitors or potential new members, but even for people who are already in the church, when churches choose silence, it can actually perpetuate damage towards LGBTQ people already in the church. Because what happens, particularly among youth, if they don't learn something from the established authorities, where will we go to learn it? The internet. Does anybody know the first 3 results if you Google, can you be gay and Christian? They're not good. They are very explicit about the fact that biblical truth will lead us to understanding how to resist the gay agenda. I can't believe that this book was published in 2014. I thought we were done talking about things like that in that way in the past 6 years, but I guess we're not. So if a kid is coming to understand themselves as gay or bisexual or trans in a church that doesn't talk about gender identity and sexual orientation, even just to say, Christian churches have a myriad of responses, we will love you no matter what. If a kid doesn't hear that, they will assume the trickle-down effect from whatever majority Christian culture says. Which means even churches where a kid might be safe to come out, that kid will internalize that they are not. Because what Christian culture is telling them is you are not safe here. You are not going to be affirmed or loved here. So LGBTQ people in churches like that might internalize that cultural hatred, might become, might internalize that cultural hatred. They might avoid any events that are gendered. If there's if we're splitting up with teenage kids, like the girls are going to go on this retreat and the boys go on this retreat, that can be a signal of if your gender identity or even your sexual orientation don't conform to the norm, you might not be safe here. LGBTQ people in churches that don't talk about issues may hear hateful comments that go unchallenged. Somebody might be chatting in the coffee line and say, oh, did you hear about those bathroom bills in North Carolina? They're starting to let men go in the women's restroom, which is not what's happening. And the 13-year-old behind them, who has just started to realize that they have been told a boy all their life, but they think they might be a girl, understands that they're not safe in this community. Because the only thing they've heard from their community is what 2 people just said in front of them. LGBTQ people might not bring their partner or their kids to church. They might have someone directly condemn them to their face and not have any pastoral protection to go to. They might leave for another church, or a good number of the people that I serve and work with at Queer Grace Community lose church and their faith altogether. A lot of the people that I work with are coming back to church after a long time away because they were simply unsafe, either in congregations that were explicitly unaffirming or congregations that were simply unable to have the conversation, and therefore they absorbed from Christian culture. I'm not safe here. I'm not truly loved here. I can't stay here. The interesting thing to all this is that there was a 2018 study that just came out by the came out 2 years ago, by the University of Texas in Austin, specifically about transgender youth, ages 15 to 21. Among transgender youth and among transgender people in general, we see significantly higher percentages of mental illness and suicidal ideation. As I already talked about, when we start letting people socially transition, those start to drop. And they found specifically for these youth ages 15 to 21, if they had their chosen name used at school, work, home, and with friends, they had 71% fewer symptoms of severe depression, a 34% decrease in reported thoughts of suicide, and a 65% decrease in suicide attempts. But the thing that really caught me in this study was that having just one context in which a transgender kid could use their chosen name, there was a 30% reduction in suicidal thoughts. Which means that there are 15 to 21-year-old kids somewhere out there who, if they just got 1 to 2 hours a week where they could come to church and have their chosen name used, we could have a 30% drop in their suicidal ideation. And to me, that's so beautifully dovetailed with the core of the Christian gospel. Not only that we are made in God's image and beloved, but that Jesus says in the Gospel of John, I came that they may have life, and life abundant. If the church could be a place that is actually a preventative against the suicidal ideation that so often strikes these kids, that could just be a place where people could be known for who they are and loved how they are. Even if we don't fully understand, even if we still need to ask questions and read books and try to understand better how people could be so different and yet still so loved. To be a place that reduces a kid's chance of suicide. How beautiful is that? How wondrous is that? How simple, too, is that for the church to be able to step into, to say, the name you bring to me and say, this is my name, I'll call you that. The way you want me to understand who you are, I'll call you that. Isn't that wondrous? Isn't that just like such a beautiful potential for churches to have and to be able to offer that much love, that much transformative grace that is just in letting a kid change a name? How great is that? Great, so that's 6 hours and 35 minutes. I'll pause there.
Nice job.
Thanks, Molly. And I'll invite you two back up if you would be willing to join me for questions.
Yeah. So, you have your mic. I'm going to give this one to Tori, if you're okay with that, T. Yeah. Well, I know really loud. What else is new? So this is a time where you can ask questions of any curiosity that you have. I'll start just to kind of get the ball rolling, and then we can launch it from there. So one of the questions I get a lot, or in the conversation, is, well, if God created us to be female, and then we go and change it, then these are God's mistakes. Yeah, and like we're messing with God's creation, and so how do you even handle that? And so with the understanding of all these understandings of non-binary and bi and gay and lesbian, like how do you respond to that in that way?
I think there's a couple of really interesting assumptions happening in that, right? I mean, how many of us wear glasses? But that's the way we were made, right? Like most of us received our farsightedness or nearsightedness genetically. So should we really be wearing corrective lenses? Because that's changing what God made. On a larger scale, my friend Austin wrote a fantastic book called Transforming, and I think the 3rd chapter, Crystal, is it a good book? Are you enjoying it?
Just finished chapter 5.
Okay, good.
When you were going through the verses, I've already got 2 picked out.
Nice.
I think chapter 3, he talks about this idea of like, well, are you saying God made a mistake? And there's a multiplicity of ways that the transgender community understands that. But I think the thing that really jumped out at me is Austin talks about like, I don't think God made a mistake. I think God made me trans. Rather than I don't think God put me in the wrong body. But like, no, I think God intentionally made me someone who doesn't conform to the box that I was placed in at birth, because it helps change my understanding of myself to something much more deeper and rich. It helps me understand other people better. It helps me understand gender expectations and roles in a different way. I've found for myself, reading the testimonies of transgender women has helped me have a much greater appreciation and understanding of what it means to be a cisgender woman, because it expands my understanding of gender beyond just the body that I was born in. In particular, I loved Janet Mock's autobiography, which now I can't remember the name of, Redefining Realness, that's it. She writes about this long trajectory of being a transgender woman, and I was just like, I feel so much more like appreciative of my body, but also just mystified by the beauty of gender. And that was so much more fun than just like gender fits into these 2 boxes. And I felt like that was so, that that really bound me up in the mystery of the way that God makes us. Sometimes when people talk about that, they'll talk about Genesis 1 and be like, well, it says specifically God made them male and female, and that's it, and that's the end of it. And the great thing is that's happening within the story of creation. And in creation and in Genesis 1, we get this constant switch back and forth between a binary. God makes light and dark. God then makes sun and moon. God makes land and sea. Well, God pulls land out of the sea. God makes the waters above and the waters below. And in all of that, there's never a rejection of the middle ground, right? It doesn't say God made day and night, and therefore evening or dawn or sunset or eclipse don't exist. The binaries exist. The two ends of this thing exist of like total darkness, total light, but there's this whole big beautiful mix, and really like the middle part of that is even more beautiful. Like a sunset is much better, right? God makes dry land and God makes sea, but then also in that is like swamp and forest and beach. And someone once pointed out to me, like, no one goes out protesting the existence of a beach. But that is also in the middle, right? It's not, like no one goes out and stands in the sand and says you have to be either dry land or water, pick one. And that beauty that like when it says God made them male and female, not male or female, but that might point to, and Hebrew sages have talked about this for thousands of years, that there is a spectrum. Not only is there darkness, light, and the whole beauty in between, sea and sand and the whole beauty in between, but there might also be male and female and a whole beauty in between.
Spectrum living is one of the terms I use a lot.
Spectrum living.
Spectrum living and the beauty in spectrum living. Yeah, thank you. Okay, who has this question? Or do you want to start with a question? Since you're up here.
Since I'm up here?
Yeah.
But yeah.
I asked a similar question in the last session, but when these people come into our lives or into our church, how do we best make them feel safe?
So I know that this conversation and this sort of the space that you're making is happening as a result of some one-on-one conversations that you had and talking about maybe a public statement of affirmation, right? That's what we sometimes talk about in the reconciling in Christ process, where a church goes through a lot of conversations, both individual and then larger group discussion, and gets to a point where we say, we want to say, on our website, in our bulletin, we are welcoming, and that includes people of any sexual orientation or gender identity. But the interesting thing is that there are little pockets of care that can happen all along the way, right? And it can be as simple as making sure, I know we talked about this earlier, that that forms when we're signing up kids for Vacation Bible School don't say mom's name and dad's name, but say parent and guardian and parent and guardian.
And we switched that over.
Yeah, which is great. That perhaps in data keeping, that we don't assume certain family structures, that we move away from using things that assume that a family has two parents or that a family has a male and female parent, that move away from, a whole lot of different assumptions that undergird so much of what we do. But especially the ability to use someone's name as they present themselves. We know how important that is. Does anybody else? So my name's Emmy. It's not short for anything. But my entire life, people have assumed that it is. So my entire life, when conversations are, hi, my name is Emmy.
Hi, what's that short for?
Yeah, it's not short for anything.
Is that short for Emily?
No, it's not short for anything.
Oh, Emmy.
And usually it's followed by, well, what's on your birth certificate? And at that point I want to be
Seriously?
like, yeah. At that point I want to be like, oh, that's what you meant by real name. I'm so sorry. I know what you mean. I know you want a longer name. I've got nothing for you. And then it's a family name. I'm named after my grandfather who lost his Italian name in the naturalization process. He came to America a medio del giorno through the process of his family not speaking English. He became Walter.
Oh my.
Yeah. So every time somebody says, well, your name can't be Emmy, what is it? I remember that my grandfather lost his name too. So that's my like, I'm cisgender. No one has ever assumed that I'm a gender different than what I am, and I still have to argue with people about my name. And one of the big gifts is going into a church that allows, either when you're running, like, I don't know how you do name tags here, but like if you have sticky name tags.
They write their own.
God bless you.
I know.
You're doing such good work. So to be able to come in and say, I'm going to write my own name, and that's what people are going to call me, right? And no one's going to say, oh, what's that short for? Because it's just right there, and I've written it.
You wrote it.
There's a really fantastic commercial that just came out from Starbucks a few months ago where you see this kid who's sort of gender non-conforming, maybe androgynous-ish, and keeps getting referred to as Gemma throughout the commercial. So you see it on the ID name tag, on the, like they're filling out a form for a college thing, they're hanging out with their dad, and dad's like, oh, you remember my Gemma, doesn't she look so great? And this kid is just looking more and more uncomfortable.
Cringy.
And then you see Gemma talking to somebody, and the person says, what's your name? And they put their head kind of up, their chin comes up, and they say, James. And then they're at Starbucks, it gets written on the cup, and then at the end of the commercial, somebody's calling out, latte for James, and James comes forward, and there's this huge smile on his face. This is actually based in reality. A lot of trans people or gender non-conforming people who are changing names will try it out at Starbucks because it's a very low, like you're only meeting people for 5 minutes and then you go away. It's not trying it out, at school or people you'll see it again later. So church can also be a space that does that if we're able to be a little more flexible with our expectations, especially for kids who are trying to figure out where they might fit and to try to have a little bit of autonomy over who they are, to say, you can write down the name you want us to call you. Does that mean that there's going to be some stinker who writes down like Mufasa?
My kid will do that.
Yes. Yes. But to be perfectly honest, it's a lot better to just let one kid be a total goof and know that we're providing space for some trans or non-conforming kid who might never get the chance elsewhere to feel safe and called by their name.
We just have to get them in the door first.
Yeah, there's that. There is that. But the thing is, just percentages and population-wise, you're gonna end up with a trans or non-conforming kid in your congregation just if people keep having babies.
That's true.
Like we don't like come from another planet.
No, I know. What? Wait, what? You don't? Tell me more.
I might have, but
You are a special case on so many
very
levels.
true. Thanks, Mom.
Does anybody else have any? Ooh, yeah, they're coming out now.
You can go first. 'Cause
Now they're waking up.
You're closest to the mic.
Yes, you do.
My question is, how do you feel about things like women's Bible study and men who love donuts and all these things that this has never occurred to me ever, that this is offensive to somebody?
I think
That's a great
That's
question.
such a great question.
So we do. We have women's Bible study and men who love donuts.
Yes, we do.
what if I like donuts?
I go.
Okay,
I show up.
Yeah, I think one of the, so I talk about Austin a lot because he's my best friend and he wrote a brilliant book, but Austin goes to a church that has like a men's group, and Austin is a trans man and has transitioned prior to joining that church. But one time, someone invited him to join the men's group. And for him, that was deeply affirming of like, this is not a men's group that expects you to be cisgender, right? Like, you identify as male, you present as male, you have asked us to call you with male pronouns, we want to invite you to the men's group too. So that was hugely affirming for him. And I think it can be done with good, I remember growing up in the Episcopal church in the 90s, there was a trans woman in our Episcopal women's group, and she won like they did a Woman of the Year award every year, and she won it one year, and I was like, that's so cool, and also really weird that we have like a Woman of the Year. Do you have that here?
No,
No.
but we can,
Interesting.
Don't start it.
Interesting.
So it can be good if it's done intentionally, and if the people in the group and the leadership are able to say like, if someone is in our congregation that is transgender, we're going to make sure that they know they're welcome with the gender with which they identify. The problem can be that it can be a little off-putting for visitors who are like, ooh, there's a men's and women's group and that means I have to like fit into one. sometimes what can help with that is just having a photo of the group. And if somebody doesn't, sometimes that can express, look at the diversity of beauty of what it means to be female and what it means to be male. And that can help communicate to visitors, we're not expecting you to come in here and look like a burly man or like a delicate flower woman. There are a whole host of ways to be in that box of gender.
And I think that's the only one really that specifies gender in our groups.
I just want to mention this when we do the Psalms. No, not the Psalm. Yeah, the Psalms between the two readings.
Sometimes we do.
We say women and men.
We don't do that very often, though.
Not anymore.
We don't.
We used to.
Yeah, we do right or left.
Great.
Pulpit or yeah.
Yeah, because.
And that happens in hymn singing too. That sometimes it'll say women voices on this verse and men voices on this verse. Thank you, Molly. What can be helpful too, even in congregations where there aren't any trans people and this isn't even a consideration, is some women just naturally have lower voices. Especially is anybody else? I know I'm an alto. And so most of the time, if you're asking me to sing the higher verse, it's going to be hard for me. And if you let me sing an octave down, I'm going to have a lot. So if you can switch back and forth between high voice and low voice instead of male and female, and then I have to try to screech out the female side of things and sound like I match everybody else.
Time out, tangent. You know how we sing Will the Circle Be Unbroken? Emmy's the one that
Oh, yeah.
wrote the lyrics to that we sing. They love it when we sing it on
You
Anthony.
tell me that every time.
I know, because they do. But Emmy's the one that wrote the lyrics to that. We're not having communion.
Go get me some bread. Communion?
My boys ate all the leftover bread. She's serious. Okay, anyway. Sean, do you want to go with your question?
It's not as much of a question as noticing, talking about how it's all about welcoming, and the thing I think of Mary with, how changing the names of St. Parents or guardians.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at how we want to be welcoming in all communities, including single parents and widowers, just all those things. So it expands much more past this, what we're talking about here. That's what I thought.
And
Just
even starting from our database used to be
you might.
head of household was
Yes.
always the male.
The male. We got rid of that
It's
too.
not.
It is not.
So, yeah.
Adult one has never wrote their name down first.
I got nothing. Just run with it.
I think, Sean, you make a great point that just by simply having the awareness of the heightened we do have a men and a women, or this is how we do perceive this. Just simply being aware of those things and how we do them is moving in a brilliant direction. So we can make sure that if we need to change it, or if we need to alter it a little bit, or just by simply noticing it, can change our demeanor and way that we approach all things.
The ability to understand that Scripture has a context, and that we can't just pull verses from it, and therefore set all of our moral standards just by what is sometimes called cherry picking, is not only helpful to the LGBT community, right? You had to preach on just recently divorce. Yeah.
Living at there.
Yes.
Go, Mayor, go.
Not this church, or church I belonged to before. Had my child in private school, knew many people there, went through divorce. All my friends disappeared.
Wow.
I left church for several years, and well-intentioned Christians can really inflict wounds.
Yep. So if a church can develop really good practices around how we talk about the interpretation of Scripture, that isn't just for the benefit of LGBTQ people, right? That's also for the benefit of people who are just trying to sit through a church service, and then Jesus has to start talking about divorce and ruin the whole day.
I know, I literally end the Gospel of our Lord with a question mark.
Yeah.
The Gospel of our Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Sit down, hang out, we'll get through this. I name that because it is uncomfortable. But yes, the Bible was written in a certain time period, and if we were to follow all those things literally, you and I wouldn't be up here right now. be
Well,
silenced.
kind of. I mean, they wouldn't know about the resurrection if women had been silenced.
I mean, true. But
We were there at the tomb. All
We
the
were-
men were hiding.
it's true. You're right. The first gospel preachers were women.
Right.
Let's just put that out there.
Can we talk about what she really was?
Mm-hmm. Mary
Love,
Magdalene.
love.
Yes.
Um,
But I mean, like, if we were to take the Bible literally and not something, like, we would need to be doing a lot of things differently in our
Yep.
lives, and we're not doing that.
Right.
So why are we taking this one of sexual identity and limiting that?
right. I mean, that's like a whole other 6-hour question.
No. We need to have you come back and lead a Bible study sometime, okay?
Sure.
See, I have it on camera, so.
Oh,
It's recorded.
that was smart.
You're welcome. I know.
You didn't do that you didn't do it the first session. That was good.
Ooh, Kirsten.
Yes, please. Can you
Can you say something about what led you into the ministry and what it was like as a non-conforming person to
Yeah.
go through that process?
Yeah, I can. Should I pitch the book?
I was just gonna say, can I pitch the book
You
before
can
you
pitch the
go?
book, yeah.
So there's this book that's for sale that Emmy just wrote. It's called One Coin Found. It's incredible. But it talks about her call story into the ministry and how God reaches to the margins and expresses and shows love to those that are on the margins. Okay, now you go.
Okay, great.
It's a great book and everyone should buy it.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, so I resisted my call to ministry for a long time because I knew myself to be gay. And that includes, like, I was growing up in the Episcopal Church. There was a trans woman in our women's Bible study. Like, the church voted in, the year that I graduated high school is the year they consecrated Bishop Gene Robinson as the first openly gay bishop of Vermont. Like, I kept getting messages all along the way, like, you're okay, we love you. And I still said, I see what's happening. I'm not gonna follow this call to ministry. Because at the same time that I'm getting these messages of like, we love you, we support you, we're not gonna use clobber verses against you, you're a beloved child of God. I'm also watching Gene Robinson's consecration, and his vest fits wrong. So he's got like the white alb and then the stole over it, and I'm like, why does it look like it's for like he looks like a football player, like there's some sort of weird padding underneath. And it's only very recently that it was only a few weeks after that I realized he was wearing a bulletproof vest. Because as the first openly gay person to be ordained to the bishop, as bishop in the Episcopal Church, there had been so many death threats that they said you have to wear a bulletproof vest. Like, it's credible enough that you might die during this church service. And I just went, like, no thank you. I will be on the next boat to Joppa. They don't know Jonah. Okay, great, that's fine. So the story of Jonah is the story of the only successful prophet in the Hebrew Bible, where God calls him and says, you have to go to Nineveh and convert them. And Jonah says no and gets on a boat to Joppa.
It's actually my call story too. I'm sure. Really? Oh, totally. But because I was a woman, I didn't want to be a pastor because I was a woman.
Oh yeah, that's fair, yeah. So yeah, I spent probably 5 years trying to run away from my call to ministry and like find ways to be involved with church but not that involved. And then got suckered in by the Lutherans.
You're welcome.
And so that's how I ended up in the Lutheran church instead of Episcopal or other denominations that I could have, because I think what I was always searching for and what I found at Lutheranism at that point in my life was that there wasn't this rejection of Scripture. It wasn't like, well, this is archaic and it's a museum piece and Jesus just wants to love everybody and we'll just follow that and we'll kind of just put this aside. What I found in the Lutheran practice was we are going to engage with and wrestle with Scripture. We are going to try to figure out how do we apply this to our daily lives, also recognizing that it has historical context. And I'm not saying I couldn't experience that in another denomination, but at that point in my life, I experienced it so clearly in the Lutheran church. And I was like, fine. If you're going to make me do this, I'll do it with them. And so that's how I ended up here.
Awesome. That's been good. Very similar.
I was wondering if
No. You need the microphone.
I'm a loud talker.
Everyone says that. Do it for the people on the camera.
You're not allowed. It's on.
Is it on?
Is it on?
It is.
Okay. I was wondering if you could address, you talked about names
Mhm.
and calling people by their chosen name. If you could address pronouns,
Mhm.
because my kid uses they, them.
Mhm.
And constantly, still to this day, has people say, that's not right, that's a plural. You
Mhm.
can't use that.
Mhm.
Thank you for asking that
That's,
question.
yep. So, we've, the LGBT community, and specifically the gender nonconforming community, has been trying to find a pronoun in English that captures the fact that they're not he, him, his, or she, her, hers for decades, if not centuries. Now there are gender neutral singular pronouns in other languages like German and Chinese, but English's gender neutral pronoun is it. And the way that we've used that word does not transfer over well to having it. I mean, like, you don't even call a dog it, right? Like, we have to gender our dogs, which is so funny when people, like, if you introduce somebody and they're like, oh, what a cute puppy, what's his name? And you say, it's a girl, and they go, oh, okay, great. And people are fine with that, which is a whole different interesting reaction when you have people confused about human gender. Anyway, this is what happens. It's after 7 o'clock and I go on tangents.
I love it.
I know. So for a long time within the communities, there were sometimes alternative pronouns. So we see some of these still exist and are used in communities like sie and zir, or ji and jim. And so they often have like a z or an x at the front. And that's sometimes pulled from German sources and sometimes from Chinese sources. But those pronouns didn't catch on in larger cisgender communities. People said, like, you can't invent a new pronoun. Like, it's either she or he or she.
Right.
And so then people said, well, we already know how to use they and them. What if we use that? Because we already know how to use that, like we already have phrases for that. We even know how to use that in a singular. If someone leaves their phone in the sanctuary and we all leave, and Molly looks and says, someone left their phone, we don't think that Molly's referring to 2 or more people who own the phone, right? We know that Molly is just saying, someone left a phone, and it belongs to that person who left it. The use of they as a singular gender neutral, or as a reference for a singular person goes back at least to Shakespeare. He uses it in Comedy of Errors. I can't remember the character's name, but he says, there's not a man I meet on the street that doesn't greet me as if I were their well-acquainted friend, rather than his well-acquainted friend. So even in that context, like, we know that there's a gender marker, and yet they don't use it. They use the third person plural. So what happened was the community had tried to create pronouns and then compromised on that and said, can we use the pronoun that's already used in English that people already know how to use? We're not asking you to learn anything you haven't learned before. And unfortunately, we still have people saying, no, we can't do that either. And what I worry about sometimes that is about just discomfort, and it's hard to start to restructure our sentences, and it takes practice. I, for a while, had people's pronouns saved in my phone behind their name so that I could practice, like, whenever I was texting them, like, oh, right, okay, Sarah uses they, them, okay, right, and I could practice that in my head. My wife and I constantly do it at home. We'll have conversations about people and make sure that we're practicing so that it becomes more fluent in public. So sometimes it's just about, I don't like change and it's uncomfortable. And for some people, it is unfortunately still about, it's not about I don't like change, it's not about, well, what's the proper English pronunciation, proper English use. It's about, I don't want to think about the fact that there is anything besides male and female. And so the unfortunate thing then that happens is people who say, well, that's just how English is, you can't change the rules, or, well, it's just too hard for me to learn new things, start to sound too much like the people who are saying those things just because they want to say you have to fit into one of these boxes. So that's one of the reasons I have been practicing really hard, and why I'm trying to get my congregation to engage with better in pronouns is not because it's a historical truth. Like, language is fluid, right? Like, if I asked you for your iPad 10 years ago, you'd be staring at me like I'd asked you for a dragon. Like, we didn't have them. They were invented in 2011. So language changes. So it's not so much for me about, like, well, they, them's always been singular, and anybody who fights it is being ridiculous. It's more that this is a concession that the gender nonconforming community made for us, So what can I do to practice and make sure to welcome them? We didn't, the large scale community didn't learn to use alternative pronouns, and so we found this middle way. And how can we meet in the middle on that?
And when talking with someone who uses they, them pronouns, they said to me the best thing that I can see is that you're trying. Even if you call me he, and then you correct yourself later, or like you know better, like you're trying, and that means a lot to them, a lot. And so that helped me knowing that like I'm trying to make the conscious effort and meeting them where they're at. I think a lot of that is taking ourselves out of it. It's not about us, and making sure that we're meeting people where they're at so they can feel comfortable as well is huge. So
Most of the time, if someone is changing a name or pronouns, those of us who've known them for a while will make mistakes. That's just a natural part of things. Sometimes we will have to be switching back and forth kind of with them based on the space that we're in. Like, is this a safe space? Is this not? And we will most likely make mistakes. The thing that I've heard from the trans and non-conforming community is if you make a mistake and you realize it, say, oh, sorry, her, or whatever, and you move on. If we make it, if it starts to become like a big apology, like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I've been trying so hard, I've been practicing at home, then all of a sudden it's about me.
yeah.
Right? Like, and now it's about making the person who I've just hurt accept my apology, and it just nobody wants this.
Nobody wants
Let's
this.
just go, oh, I'm sorry, Molly, and then move on.
Got it.
And then it keeps becoming a pattern of practice that we can get to.
Also, I love that you incorporated that you said, oh, sorry.
Oh yeah.
That's a miss.
It is a misunderstanding. It's like we say to the shopping cart. The shopping cart that no one is by in Target, we still treat it as an object that we need to be nice to.
Oh, sorry. It's totally true. It is 7:15, so I want to honor time, but if anybody does have any other final questions before we wrap up, otherwise I'm going to stick around for a little bit if you have any personal one-on-ones you want to talk to her about. She's going to be out by where her books are. She is selling her books, and she accepts all forms of payment.
The cash credit and check, not like
No
first minute.
chickens or.
No Bitcoin? No Bitcoin?
Sure.
I actually do have a Bitcoin
Oh, do you?
wallet, so I can take Bitcoin.
I was kind of kidding.
Is that a thing?
That's so funny. I don't know.
My brother-in-law works in Mountain View, so like all the family owns Bitcoin now. Okay, we are down a rabbit hole.
We are.
Pray us out.
Yes, please pray
Okay,
us out.
great.
Thank you.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Holy One, we give you thanks for this courageous space where we come with our questions and wonderings. God, you made us in your image full of beauty and delight, full of creativity and self-understanding, full of compassion and mercy for those like us and those unlike us, for those who love us and those who confuse us. May your Spirit bless our hearts and minds. May your godly strength strengthen our hands and feet. May your Son walk beside us, empowering us to better understand and care for, and most of all, love each other. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you all for coming as well. Please feel free to stick around or come talk to one of us or head out.